Welcome, Kate. We've just come out of the session this morning of the Oxford Conference, and you've been talking about housing projections and planning for housing more generally, following on from your reviews back in 2004-2006. I was wondering, having listened to what you said, whether the scale of error in projections and household size and the difficulty which you've acknowledged that there is in projecting and then planning for the future. Does that mean we're actually doing too much planning? When we get down to the level of detail on tenure, on size, the numbers generally, that we actually ought to be slightly more modest about our ability to plan for 10, 15, 20 years ahead?
I think that is what I believe. I'm very struck when I go back and look at the work I did 12 years ago, by, in a sense, some of the ideas about needing to have greater housing supply have been very well accepted. But some of the things we talked about in that plan have somehow got lost along the way. So we were keen to try to discourage people from attempting this very detailed planning, the kind of type mix affordability stuff that local authorities were asked to do, because it's, goodness me, as an economist, you know just how difficult it is to forecast anything 5 or 10 years ahead. So how on earth you would know what tenure mix you needed in an area is really hard to say. But the main thrust, in a sense, of what I was wanting to talk about today was that somehow the term housing need, has come up. If you read the NPPF or you read the other documents, they're all about housing need. And actually, if you go back to the report, what I was writing about was housing demand, and they are not the same thing.
Could you say a bit more about that? So, I've listened to what you said and read your paper. The question I had in my mind would be, if you were to plan with housing demand more in mind, what would that mean? I mean, how would that change the way in which we plan? I think we've all got quite used to, ever since the NPPF was published, we've got used to this concept of need. We all sort of think we know what it means, and it's become pretty fundamental to our planning system. If that word was to include, if the term was to include need and demand, how would that change things?
It's true if you sort of look at any modelling of the housing market that's done by macroeconomists, for what modelling done by macroeconomists is ever worth, they would always put into their work not just how many people they expect to arrive, and I talk quite a bit in the paper about how uncertain we are about how many people we're going to have in the country and the huge mistakes we've often made about that in the past. But they also talk about what's happening to income growth, because as people get richer, they tend to want more space. They want more spare rooms, or they want a second home. And if you don't include income growth as well as how many people you've got, you end up with the wrong answer. i.e. you don't build enough houses, and then prices will tend to rise. And the difficulty with that, or the difficulty that I see and what I care about, is that the outcome is that richer people usually get the housing they want, and the poor end up kind of huddling up, because they end up having not enough housing. And I think for me that leads on to another point I want to make, which is that when you're doing a plan, you sort of read it, and I understand that there's sort of more to it than this, but a lot of it is about, almost how few houses can we get away with putting in the plan. And the question you ought to be asking is, for the people who want to live in this area over the next 5 to 10 years, what's the outcome I want to have? What ability do I want them to have to buy houses? And so it's really trying to understand how those drivers will all feed through, rather than try and sort of say, well, I could probably get away with this few market housing and then I'll have to provide a bit of social rent. And if you approach it in that way, you will end up with the wrong answer, and you will end up with a lot of housing market stress. And today, and in some sense I feel very strongly about this, we have so many people in private renting who are in real financial difficulties, and that has turned out to be the outcome. In the past, it was often people who were struggling with their mortgages. Today, we've got better at keeping people out of struggling with their mortgages, and instead they're struggling in the rented sector.
Does that inevitably mean that sort of tension between providing for housing demand or need and the environment would get greater? I mean, this is something that the NPPF tries to balance, the need against environmental constraint. And it's something that people, as they do get richer, they also put more value on the environment, on the importance of countryside or whatever. Do you think actually planning will inevitably end up dealing with even greater tensions than it deals with at the moment?
I'm quite sure that as we have a rising population in the southeast, that you will end up with more acute environmental problems. But I don't think they are well served by the focus of planning on it all being done by individual local authorities. No. We know that environmental issues around the kind of countryside and access to the countryside, or around biodiversity, how species move, or around water stress, don't confine themselves to local authority areas. Species don't live in local authority areas, they live in habitats. And I worry that actually the localism of planning and the sort of narrow focus actually gives you the wrong answer from the environmental point of view as well. I'm not immediately sure. I mean, planning for housing is based on the idea that housing is environmentally costly. Now, I'm not going to pretend it isn't environmentally costly, but I do often make the point that actually it's people that are environmentally costly as well as the houses. The houses, after all, it's a number of people you have often that adds to the stress on it. Yeah. It adds the stress on a place, particularly around traffic. But I do think these issues are important, and I think they get better recognised if we plan at a wider area. But I also think we have failed to have this, I don't talk about this in the paper, a serious conversation about what the environmental cost of new housing itself, housing being housed more generously, is. There is a cost to letting more people have more spare rooms and all that. But we don't have anywhere any very sensible or coherent view of what that cost is. And then bizarrely, once people can move into a home, we don't tax them. Other things we think are environmentally harmful, we tend to tax. Housing, oddly, we think is environmentally harmful, but we take away tax on it. We take away inheritance tax. It's most odd.
Do you think the balance between taxation of new development and taxation of existing homes is in the wrong place? Do you think that could be adjusted?
Well, I think the taxation of new homes, if by that you mean 106s, I don't kind of really, in some sense, I don't kind of see that as taxation. I kind of see it as a recognition that the state has conferred the planning permission, and they too might want to get something out of it. So I'm not sure I see that as a tax. I do think that existing housing for people in owner occupation is undertaxed.
Okay, going back to that geographical level of planning, the greater than the local, and the need for that. Have you got any thoughts on how that might be done? I mean, you mentioned possibility. Well, you mentioned regional spatial strategies, which I don't think we're going to see come back anytime soon. But do you have other ideas as to how that might be done?
I think this is really difficult because, after all, we're a long way on with plans at the moment. We've got this great pressure on people producing local plans, and local authorities are really getting on with it because they want to be protected against developers. So actually to reintroduce something that sits above that at this stage is quite difficult. We do have planning inspectors who come along and try and encourage a lot of local areas to think more about their neighbours. The difficulty with that, I think, is twofold. One is you don't always get the same planning inspector in the neighbouring authorities, so they may have different views and obvious. And you could resolve this by getting the inspectorate itself to take to have a slightly more coherent view of areas. Or you could really strengthen the duty to cooperate. You could say to local authorities, look, your plan is simply not sound unless you have really taken account of what's going on elsewhere. We're seeing a bit more of that happening. But of course, some of the plans are already there. The trouble is, because they're all done sequentially, it's very hard then to go back. So I think it's a combination of a stronger duty to cooperate and actually making sure that plans that don't meet today's standards are reviewed early.
One final question, the analysis of the Hertfordshire authorities, which I did find interesting. Do you think the problems you found in getting to the data, getting to what's going on, do you think they're presentational problems, or do you think they're more revealing of a fundamental difficulty with that plan-making system?
I'm pretty confident that the reason it's hard to find out on local authority sites quite where they are with their plan isn't because local authorities want to obfuscate. I actually think that people do find it very difficult to get their plans done, and therefore they find it very difficult to present the paperwork for all their plans in a coherent way. And I don't think that is helpful, because one thing that in England particularly, I think is problematic, is that we have not really succeeded in involving people very much. Maybe neighbourhood plans will help in the plan making process. Consequently, people are always surprised when development projects come forward and then they oppose them. So it means that having been through these long convoluted plan making processes, we still haven't really got local consent. So we do need to think about plan making to make it more relevant and crisper, so that people feel it's a bit more real.
Okay. Thanks very much, Kate. I really enjoyed that and enjoyed your talk. Thanks again for agreeing to do it.
Thank you for asking me.